This is the one in Denmark, the old worms. And it shows you, all right, so you have not only the giant sea turtle shells and stuffed animals up above from different parts of the world, bows probably from the Americas, a sculpture probably from the Dayak people, just stuff from all over the world where this person, dang, that almost looks like a vertebrae of a whale. But all of this just put in there as seashells, right? But they are all just in essence thrown in there into this large room. You could walk in and walk around Dropjaw for a while. John Tradescant. He was one of the first ones to publish a catalog of his collection. All right, so text and drawings of what he had in his collection. It was Musm Tradescantianum. That collection actually ended up eventually at Oxford University. And it's the foundation for the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. What's amazing about this, because he also had a fascination for the New World. He visited Virginia between 1628 and 1637. So this was after the Jamestown Wars. Visits Virginia. It's been subdued. There's a strong English military presence there. And he brought back different kinds of flora and fauna. And the flora, among it being trees like magnolias, cypress, tulip, garden plants like phlox and asters. But he also brought American Indian objects back with him. One of them is very significant. It's called Powhatan's mantle. You ever heard of Powhatan? Who's Powhatan's daughter? Pocahontas. Dead on. A mantle is something you wear about your shoulders. And all of these circles represent his kingdom. The areas that he controlled or peoples who he had under his sway of influence. So it shows you the side. When he was wearing it, this would be on his back. And then this would be the side that was touching his skin. All right, this was the cape that he wore. This is the same cape that he wore when they were trying to crown him as a lord of the King of England. Because if he'd accepted that crown, it meant that all of his land would then belong to the King of England. He wouldn't do it. But that mantle, we have a famous Disney movie out of it. And Powhatan is in the movie, and so is his daughter. She has a much larger role in it. There really was a Pocahontas. This is from the Gwich'in people, but it's one of the things that we see about some of these is the influence, too, already of European style of attire. How do you know this has been influenced by European? Closer fitting. It's more like an officer's coat. A lot of early native clothing started to adopt military-style coats. And you see where it's more cut with arms. Earlier ways that the attire was made is you take the hide, you cut a hole in it, you drop it over, and then just sew it shut. Right? This took a lot of work in order to do this. You need metal scissors to be able to cut that precisely. And so there are even at the time this object is collected, we're already seeing an influence from Europe. And then there were learned societies by the late 15th century who collected, researched, discussed, and experimented with the works. Gave rise to things like the Royal Society of England, the Academy of Sciences in Paris. These are still European institutions, though. And an important part of a nation declaring its nationhood, you'll find that any nation that has come into a new name, one of the very first things they will do as an instrument of state will be to develop starts with an M, a museum. When a nation comes to be and they want to have something to portray its history, you're going to see a museum appear. Within a decade, because every nation needs to have its own sense of identity, such as Mokna, for example, Institute of American Indian Arts. It had its own museum very quickly after the school was started. So either to accompany colonization or nationhood. So you've got the British Museum, 1759. 1786, the Peel Museum in Philadelphia. By the way, Washington, D.C. was not the original capital of the United States. The Louvre, 1793. What had happened only 3 years earlier in France? French Revolution. Throwing off, have you ever heard of Marie Antoinette? The Smithsonian Institution. All of these to enlighten and to improve the public. Because by the time the Louvre emerges, because in a very real way, the French Revolution was inspired by the United States Revolution. Les Miserables, yes. Yeah. So they're established or reinforced national identity. And then an important museum comes to be in the United States in the 20th and 21st century, because it has its beginnings in the collection of a man whose name was George Gustav Hay. The Hay Foundation was in New York City in a really, really intense part of town. And if you went into the Hay collection, it was a city block of, if you can imagine rooms this size, just piled to the ceiling with stuff. This guy collected everything. He had a lot of money, and he had a fascination for ethnographic stuff. So he had a vast collection of this hemisphere of indigenous peoples. And it was starting to really fall into disrepair. So they opened a temporary installation in New York City at the Customs House. And then that collection would eventually become what? The Customs House collection ends up moving to D.C., although they still have an institution. It's part of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. As a curator, then, within these vast collections, what does curate mean? To take care of.
Well, I remember because I took your class before, and you went on the recent road, defining the meaning of where the word curation was derived from. And I think you're going to get there in a minute, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll get to that on Wednesday.
Oh,
Okay, but introduce that notion. What is a curator? There are stereotypes about curators, in the sense that, particularly because of these blockbuster exhibits, that often people think of curators as, salmon pate, wine drinking, party going individuals, living the high life. Well, yeah, that's one kind of curator, all right, the Elvis curator. Hopefully in our communities you won't be one of those, because it's also a political position. It is in many ways an ethnographic and anthropological position. It's a scholarly position. It's a humanistic position. That's where we start to look at the value even of edutainment, ways that people become engaged and enjoy learning, want to come to learn. One of the things, for example, and that's why we are going to, for one of our projects, is we're going to be looking at photographs. And because particularly now, photographs are historical records. And that there are certain concerns that you need to have with photography, particularly when it's printed, that involve not only curation, but conservation. But if you want to get buy-in from a community, when you're just starting up a culture center, one of the first best things you can do is have people bring in family photos and find some way to connect it to cultural activity. Because people will not only want to go to see their own pictures in a museum, they'll want to bring their friends and other family to see their pictures in the museum. So curation is going to be more than this staid and static, stuffy activity. That we are in a very real way looking at manners that we can empower our communities to promote positive messages, to give us not only political, but cultural strength as we face incredible dilemmas in the 21st century.